So listen, if you want to do serious circuit board soldering, you want precise control over how much heat you use and where that heat goes. That means you need a soldering station like the Metcal GT120. Why? Because it heats your soldering tip to the right temperature quickly, it holds that temperature exactly, and it quickly recovers to that temperature after transferring heat into your workpiece. Oh, you want one? Well, you're in luck because TechniTool is giving away a Metcal GT120 and it's signed by Mythbusters alum Tori Belici. Right. So if you want one, go check out Tori's GT120 unboxing video first and then enter to win. You can enter at www.techni-tool.com/Metcal-giveaway. And I'll put that all on the screen for you because there's no way you're going to remember to type that all in. And we're going to put a link in there because you want easy access to win that Metcal, don't you? So get going. All right, guys, I'm Nicolette, and today Brian and I are here with Robbie Paul. He is the Director of IoT Business Development with Digi-Key, and he is going to talk to us today about, yes, IoT, but we are going to talk about some of the stuff that's going on, what's happening, where are we going? So thank you for joining us today, Robbie. We really appreciate your time today.
Hey, great to be here. Thank you.
Why don't you kick us off?
By the way, let's just start with the fact that we love IoT.
We do. You're in good hands.
So do I.
I hope so. but let's just kick off. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how'd you get here? How'd you get into the IoT world?
Yeah, so I've been with Digi-Key Electronics for almost 10 years now, and focused on IoT, I'd say, for the last 3 to 4 years. And I'm an engineer by education and was always super interested in tech, and always my whole career I've been in tech. And when I first came to Digi-Key, actually, I was in the LED lighting business, which was an interesting business, and it's evolved into IoT. Actually, it's more smart lighting now, and it's got all sorts of tentacles in there. But yeah, it's just been a fun ride, and Digi-Key is a wonderful company to work for. So glad to be leading the IoT initiative there.
I remember a story. Richard Comerford, who used to be one of the editors of Electronic Products, was telling me he was actually in a meeting, and I want to say it was maybe the 70s or 80s, and they were talking about IP addresses, and this is how they were talking about light bulbs, and eventually light bulbs would have IP addresses, and this was in the 70s and 80s before any of us were really even thinking about that, and computers weren't really mainstream. It's pretty crazy that people have been thinking about IoT for that long.
Exactly. And it's evolved through, many names. It was machine to machine learning and all these other pseudonyms before that. But yeah, people have been thinking about how to get the human out of that whole, machine to machine connection and how to add intelligence at different levels. So yeah, it's not something that just got hatched, a few years ago.
Right.
Right. We know that IoT is trending, but we're in it, right? So we're in it every day. What about, how big is it really? People may not be aware. They buy the smart light bulb, they buy the Alexa. Do they understand how big the market really is?
I don't think so. And I don't think any of us do, right? Because IoT is about making everything smart and connected. And I mean everything, from light bulbs to big machines to farm equipment to cars. Mm-hmm. So it's a growing pie. So it's hard to put bounds around it. And, to me, does it really matter if it's 20 billion, 100 billion, $1 trillion. It doesn't change what we're trying to do right now, right? And, I mentioned I've been in tech all my life, and I got involved at a personal level because it was cool. Mm-hmm. And really, as I get more involved with this and understand IoT, I think it's really got the potential to solve some of the world's most acute challenges, right? In food, in health, in finance, sustainability. And I think that's the difference. It's the mindset of not just, hey, can I connect a light bulb to the internet and I can control it from anywhere in the world. That's cool, but Are you really solving any major problems? And I think that's where the focus needs to change as well. And it's happening. It really is.
So we know it's big, but I mean, given that it's so big, there are so many manufacturers out there who are trying to, they're developing all kinds of things for these applications. Now, I guess my question is, what separates one from the other? I mean, how do you decide when there's so much competition out there?
Yeah, and that's an interesting, part or way to look at it, because a lot of people make traditional automated products, and those products are getting better by the day. But if you take a step back and look at what's happening even with the internet overall, right? You went from what we call Web 2.0, which was really about mobile and social and cloud, let's say, recently as 5 to 7 years ago, to Web 3.0, which is more about edge computing, AI, and decentralized networks. So when we look at, who may be the winners in the future, it's those companies and manufacturers that are aligned with these broader themes of the internet and really riding that wave of the internet. Because IoT by itself, as you mentioned, it's just generating tons and tons of data to the point that we can't even analyze it. We're not capable of analyzing it, right? So we need AI, and you need what's called edge computing, which is really you're taking the data centers, which are centralized with Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, and really pushing it out to the edge. So the edge of the network that's actually capturing the data is intelligent enough to know what data is good to send up to the cloud to be further analyzed. So it's really edge computing and AI is really what's going to drive those applications in the future, because there's just so much data being generated.
It's interesting too when you talk about AI here, right? And you're talking about AI, so it's analyzing the data before it even goes, okay, I'm going to send it out there, or when it's coming in. So, right. So how important then does it become to really build those AI pieces to actually make the IoT, especially when you start getting into like autonomous vehicles, right? There's all this data that's going to be coming in and all these various points that the AI has to really, like, a crucial point for the for things like autonomous vehicles and robots to really interact. So the effort that has to be put into the AI piece of this, how big is that?
Yeah. So a key piece of that is, what are those applications that need fast response times, right? So you mentioned autonomous cars and robotics. They don't have the time to wait for the information to get sent up to the cloud, analyzed, and then the answer returned, right? They have to act in milliseconds or microseconds. And so you need to do all that analysis right at the edge, at the point where the data is actually being gathered. And so, compute power is getting smaller and faster and less expensive. And so all of those macro trends are really enabling what we call edge computing, which ultimately reduces traffic to the cloud. We may not see it because the traffic is growing exponentially, and if you see a slight dip in it, it doesn't mean a whole lot, but there is a significant reduction in it.
So how much does that also mean for the data centers, right? If you're doing it at edge computing with autonomous vehicles, right? Now it's saving a lot of space, because that's a lot of data that's not getting uploaded. And even just the transfer of the data becomes huge, the savings, I should say.
Yeah. And that to me is like the third leg of this, right? We got edge computing, we got AI, and then we've got decentralized networks. It started with Bitcoin. Where you have what they call distributed computing. So rather than having a centralized third party running a cloud platform or a compute platform, it's all centralized and or decentralized and spread through the internet. And we're seeing initiatives within IoT actually that using decentralized networks and blockchain. So there's a network called Helium. Not sure if you guys, it's a connectivity. So LoRa is a connectivity protocol, similar to cellular or Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. And it's an open source protocol. And what Helium has done is really introduce two facets. One is decentralized it, and two, applied blockchain technology. So instead of having, like with cellular, you have carriers that have cellular base stations all over the place. And home, you've got a Wi-Fi hotspot. Well, the LoRa network or the Helium network, what they've done is they've said, okay, why don't individuals create hotspots around their businesses or their homes or apartments? And what the Helium network does is aggregate all these hotspots.
Gotcha.
And they are expanding rapidly. In fact, I've got a hotspot around my house, and it's got, the LoRa network is a long range technology. So whereas Wi-Fi is a couple hundred yards or meters, LoRa can go up to several miles. Right. So it's a pretty big hotspot, right? And the reward, so how the Helium network pays me to run that hotspot is through blockchain technology. So they use a cryptocurrency to pay me. So I have an incentive to keep the hotspot up and running. I mean, so that's a very cool way of doing that implementation. So rather than having a central company that needs to put up all these hotspots, you know, it's a lot of capital, and then you kind of decentralize that work. And that's going to happen in 5G, because 5G, it's not only a faster technology compared to LTE, but it's also got some spectrum in there that is that's non-licensed, if you will. And so anybody can set up a 5G hotspot. And so that's the next trend in IoT, is localized hotspots for cellular. So rather than waiting for an AT&T or Verizon coverage, you can get coverage. I mean, New York City would be a prime example, where individuals or businesses can set up their own cellular hotspot and get paid back in cryptocurrency. So that's a very neat execution of blockchain technology within IoT.
Right. That's actually pretty cool, because if you look at LoRa, a lot of times that was used for like farming, right? Initially for like farming and stuff like this. And that's actually bringing this, to your point, bringing this into like New York City or into like more populated areas where people would be more likely to use something like that.
Exactly. And so it becomes more useful to most users, because then they don't have to worry about keeping up a LoRa network, et cetera. They just have the sensors that automatically connect to the network, just like your phone automatically connects to a cellular service. So it's really simplifying it.
How does this affect the engineers? We talk to a lot of engineers here in the audience. What should they think about as things like this start, creeping up?
Yeah. So if you look at the folks that are putting up these hotspots, they're not very technical. They're in it for the cryptocurrency, right? And the reward. And so a challenge to a development engineer would be, well, my customer now is somebody who's not necessarily, I don't want to say tech savvy, because they are, but like the engineering piece of it, right? So they need to design and develop products for the layperson, not just the consumer that's got the sensor, but the person who's deploying the technology itself is a layperson. So, it's not like you're going to deal with the engineers at AT&T putting up a base station. You're dealing with a layperson. Right. So the approach is completely different.
Right. It's almost like build it into your advice and then just have the question, do you want to become part of the LoRa network and make some crypto on your way? Right.
Exactly.
That's what you need to do. Build it in.
And it's incredible that the Helium network is growing. They just crossed 200,000 hotspots globally, and they're adding about 1,500 to 2,000 a day.
Wow.
And what's limiting that, because we sell some of the miners as well, it's really the supply chain issues we're having in electronic components. And so that's the limiting factor right now, because if you go and try to buy a Helium miner, the lead time is about 4 to 6 months.
Right. So
it's incredible.
So is all the disruptions in the supply chain creating like a delay in what's happening with IoT, the advances right now?
Yeah, we're fortunate at Digi-Key to sort of get a bird's eye view on the entire development community. And we have not seen a slowdown in development. In fact, I would say COVID and other factors have accelerated the need for different solutions, and as such has accelerated development itself. Where we are seeing a slowdown is the actual deployments. Mm-hmm. Because of lack of personnel and just lack of access, right? The folks that you want to deploy with are not available, they're working from home, et cetera. So we are seeing a delay in deployments. But we're thinking that that's relatively short term, next 6 to 9 months max, it should ease up, and a lot of the supply chain issues, especially on the electronic side. I can't speak for the general supply chain issues, but yeah, on the electronics front, as the fabs come up, we see a little bit of easing in the second half of next year. But definitely a factor. So it's odd that COVID's caused the shortage, but it has also caused the acceleration. So it's kind of, we don't know what the net result is.
So is it almost like the acceleration is in the pre-planning stages? It's really just kind of the execution that is being held up then. So you have all these great things going on, but you can't get them out the door yet?
Yes, pretty much. And new and different ideas, right? When it comes to crowd control or knowing how many occupants are in a retail space and all those solutions that really were not that exciting 2 years ago, all of a sudden are front and center now, in terms of occupancy and safety and other, how to use technology to make our lives better in the new environment that we are in.
Sorry, Nicola.
Do you see a lot of repurposing previous things? You mentioned tracking of crowds in a retail space. I mean, you're using pre-existing technology kind of and just applying it to new settings. Is there a lot of that going on across the board?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's sort of like accelerated, what do they call it? Creative destruction, right? So a lot of the ideas that were trying to be applied to in certain cases are just not viable anymore, and others are, becoming more viable. So it's back to what are the solutions that really provide that return on investment for those people making those investments. Right. So it's kind of interesting.
Did you find engineers also with some of the shortages that were happening? Because a lot of times when devices are designed, they'll have a tendency to use certain chips or whatever that they've used that are maybe older. Did you find people trying out different components and using different parts during this with their development?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you go back to our tech center and one of the most popular requests is, you don't have that part, what other part can I use in place of it? Right. And that's not easy, especially now where most manufacturers have some kind of unique footprint or form factor or something that's unique about it that makes it difficult just to swap components out, intentionally so, right?
Yeah.
They don't want their products to be commoditized and swapped out. And a lot of that is becoming firmware. So, the product may look the same. It's a chip with, 20 feet on it, but it's the firmware that's different. And the companies that are able to quickly develop firmware for the new products are the ones that we're seeing are doing better.
Now, here's a question, because we talk about this a lot, Nicolette and I, with engineers and software. Did you find some of the engineers actually changing some of the firmware
Oh, absolutely.
to equate for us? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not quite there yet, but I see AI being used to do that. In other words, to say, okay, here's a software or firmware for one chip. How do you translate that to fit this chip? Because it's sort of a translation problem, really, right? And so we're getting these AI translators that could be able to do that at the software level, and that's killer. If you can have software writing software.
Yeah, develop some pretty smart AI for that part.
Yeah.
No, as we talk about supply chain issues and IoT, that reaches out into the industrial space as well, and all of the robotics, and you're talking about the AI taking on the tasks. Now, what about robotics in terms of the supply chain? where the role of this robotic assistance in the supply chain, like where do you see it going, and how do you see it improving supply chains and maybe preventing some of the issues that we're having now eventually?
Yeah, it's back to what we talked about before, really the application of edge computing and AI,
Yeah.
Along with a robot, which is like an electromechanical, beat. You can think about it that way. And so I think that starting off with the perception, right? It's not a thing that is intended to replace a human. It's more about how can robots, work hand in hand with humans. So what tasks can we offload from the human being, the repetitive, mundane tasks, but still retain that judgment and intelligence that the human provides, right? And so it's still all about, at the end of the day, improving productivity, reducing inefficiencies, improving safety, etc. And so depending on the scenario, if it's a hazardous environment versus just a regular factory type environment, I think you're going to see different applications of robotics. But the second part of that is too, these are not separate or distinct entities, right? To have networked robots that can work more holistically is also a big driver, because then what that provides is flexibility and adaptability. So if something upstream from the production changes, the robot that's downstream should be able to adapt and change to accommodate that slight difference. So it's not just a mundane repetitive task of putting on a screw or a bolt. It's about being able to maneuver a little bit and work in concert with other robots as well.
Right. Now we've seen a lot with, IoT robotics, right? The industrial part of it, especially with like warehousing and things like that. But also, I think for me, I think one of the big things we're going to see is delivery. Those robotic pieces and autonomous vehicles being used so much for delivery in the supply chain in the future.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That last mile or last 100 feet really of delivery is going to be a major challenge. And there's quite a bit of savings to be had in that last 100 yards of delivery as well. And I think it's Amazon that has a little bot in a college setting. I think I saw they were making deliveries, the Amazon Prime deliveries to student dorms and things like that. So
yeah, I know FedEx was testing it like in downtown Memphis for a while, because I was there when they were actually testing the robot. Like it was navigating the streets, like dropping off stuff. So.
Right. Yeah. And to me, when I talk about robots, I include drones in there as well.
Absolutely.
They have industrial applications to, we talked about farming and what's going on in the West with the fires and other hazards. I mean, the drones provide, such an advantage on getting that 50,000 foot view, if you will, of what's going on, the macro view. So it's when you talk about the broader scheme of robotics with autonomous vehicles, drones, industrial robots, it's getting scary.
Yeah. Well, we just had a huge discussion on like even, wireless powering of those drones and those robots and how they know what dock is. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, a dock's empty. Let me go charge here. Or when do I need to go charge based on what they're doing? So it's great. Like all of that is IoT, like all those pieces.
It is. And, the ultimate vision is what Tesla's working on, which is the general purpose robot that can do pretty much what a human being can do, right? In terms of picking stuff and moving it around and being able to navigate a natural environment autonomously. And I think if that can be achieved, that's going to be a killer application, because the possibilities at that point just become endless.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And it's much different than like Robonaut that JPL did, that was like big, bulky,
Exactly. Yeah.
Where this is like pretty much designed like a human being.
Yep. Yeah, because the world we've built is really designed for us, right? 2 legs, 2 hands, and 2 eyes. And so if you can build a humanoid robot like that. It can use what we've built already. So yeah, and that's what's interesting about technology. I think we don't appreciate how fast these changes are going to happen with AI and things like that. We always think linearly about things, but with AI, it's massively exponential. And I think that phrase is slowly, then suddenly. Right, all of a sudden it's upon you, and everybody's surprised. It's alive, but it just happens in AI time.
Yeah, I know.
AI time. I like that.
And back to the point we almost started with, right? Things have been being worked on and developed, and all these pieces. It's just, to your point, it's like over sudden it's just here, and it's part of just everyday life.
Yeah, and I also think if you look at the smartest folks in Silicon Valley, they've all been focused so far on how to get your attention and keep your attention and get you to click more, right? And going back to what we said originally is we're in a changing world with very, very different problems. So how do we get the smartest people to focus on the big problems of the world, which is food and health and sustainability and even finance, right? To say, I think the phrase is fix the money and fix the world, right? So I think finance is an underlying structural component that really needs fixing. And so it's like, how do you get them excited to work in IoT versus going to work for, hate to name names, but Facebook or Twitter or somebody else trying to grab your attention? We got to get more smart people in IoT. We really do.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because you see a lot of the industry accepting IoT, like businesses and things like that, bringing in because they know they could evolve. And I think Nicolette brought this up earlier, when we were talking about like light bulbs, and sort of that's how consumers see it, but they're not seeing the bigger picture. And when do we think consumers are really going to see that bigger picture?
I think they're adopting it well, right? So if you look at consumer versus commercial adoption of IoT, I'd say the consumers embraced it more. If you look at home automation, I've got all Siri controlled lights and thermostats and everything else. And in the commercial setting, it's just not there. We deal with AI bots on Facebook and Google News and Twitter. All of that is AI. So I think consumers are interfacing with AI and just IoT a lot more. Mm-hmm. And in the commercial setting, it's more about where's the ROI. It's not about convenience necessarily for the employee, where adoption happens, right? And so that's finally happening. And that's why we see industrial applications and agriculture where there are true ROI involved, either a cost savings or a productivity improvement is where we're seeing traction within the commercial space itself. But I'd say these are just still early days.
Yeah. I'm just curious when like Siri starts making decisions for people, if people are going to be ready for that, because how it's very command based right now. It's very much you tell it what to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was reading a book. So, if in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to read something, right, you would go to the priest or the rabbi and say, oh, hey, what should I read? And then of course the priest or the rabbi will say, you just need to read the Bible. It'll tell you everything you need about life. Right? And then in the 18th, 19th century, where humanism came on, it was like, if you go and ask somebody, what should you read? They'll be like, well, go read what you want to read. Mm-hmm. Right. And then that's where we had this explosion of different topics and subjects of interest for a lot of people. And then today, you go into the Amazon virtual bookstore, and you've got Amazon recommending what I should be reading, right? They say, hey, I know who you are. I know what you like. I know where you live. I know what your interests are. And these are the books you should read. So to me, Amazon and Google and Facebook, they're all telling us what to do, what to read, what to eat, right? If I want to eat something, I go look at Yelp, and it's that Yelp recommendation that may drive me to a certain restaurant or a type of food. So I think we've got AI already telling us what we should be doing. It's just we think we're in control, and we have free will and all of that stuff.
Illusion.
But really, those subtle recommendations are really driving what we do and say and eat and read.
Yeah. It's when Yelp all of a sudden just delivers it to your house and you don't even know. That's when it.
There you go.
I knew you were thinking about this.
Yeah, you knew where I was going with this.
Yeah. It is. It's a crazy world we're about to enter with real AI, and I can see a time when you just go to Google and say, "Who should I marry?" And they'll have a list of recommendations of compatible or,
based on your search history. That may not be good.
I mean, there's so many platforms out there right now that match personality. And so it's not, unforeseeable that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And we're just accepting it, right? So we the convenience, the ease of use, and rather than me going and trying to find a book, if somebody tells me to read this, I'll go read it.
Right.
It's just human nature.
Right. No, and back to the point, we were joking about Yelp, but think about it. There are smart refrigerators. And if they know you're out of milk, order the milk, you know what I mean? And have it delivered. I mean,
right.
I think people, I would love that,
Yeah. Yeah. And they can steer it to any brand or any company that you may or may not agree with. So it's interesting how convenience trumps a lot of our decision making. But brave new world.
Well, as we're entering this brand new world, we're embarking on all of this. I'd like to just tie it up with something else for the engineer. The engineer who's developing right now. What would you like to leave them with as we've now talked, for a while now about all of these great things that are happening, that are going to happen, that are delayed, but are happening, all of this, what should the engineer be thinking about?
I would say, look at the bigger picture. What problems of humanity are we trying to solve? And go after that. It doesn't, it could be a piece of that, but somehow what you're doing today should somehow connect to a bigger story, a bigger solution than just, hey, I'm going to make this light bulb flash 6 times, right? So it's how does that connect to the bigger world? And we tend to be focused on different stuff. There's a lot of half the world's population, don't have internet access. Even more are unbanked. And so how do you get that half involved? So it's not just about creating a gee whiz solution for, let's say, the rich half of the world. How do you get the other half of the world connected? Because I think that's the real potential. How can you get kids excited in the third world about something? That's where it starts with internet connectivity and different solutions. The solutions that will work there are not the solutions that currently work here. So we got to think creatively of how that's going to happen. So I would say, look at the bigger world. We live in a small world, but it's still pretty big, and there's still a pretty big divide. So let's get the other half on board, and we'll all benefit from that. We'll sell more stuff. We'll share more information. It's just going to be better. More is better with the world. So.
Well, thank you so much, Robbie. We really appreciate your time today. And if there's anything you want to shout out that you're doing over at Digi-Key, please tell us. Leave us with something.
Well, we've got a lot of different customers doing a lot of different things, and we are just thrilled to be, a piece of what they do. And they come up with the most creative solutions and products and services, stuff that we can't even imagine. So it's just great to be part of that bigger development community that's doing a lot of wonderful things. And I'm a strong believer that, tech is a part of the solution for a lot of the world's problems. So glad to be a part of it.
Thanks again, Robbie.
All right. Thanks, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
At a pro baseball game, when a hometown hero hits a grand slam, a lucky fan ends up with an autographed bat. Why not celebrate that same passion in electronics? Technitool is giving away a top-of-the-line Metcal GT120 soldering station signed by Mythbusters alum Tori Belleci. Unlike autographed sports gear, you won't want to leave it in a display case. Check out Tori's GT120 unboxing video. Go to technitool.com/Metcal giveaway and enter for a chance to win. We'll also drop the link where you're watching this or listening to this below.